Good morning, everybody. We're going to get started. It's 8 o'clock. Wanted to welcome everyone to the 12th annual Treuman Katz Lecture in Pediatric Bioethics. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Doug Opel. I'm faculty here in the Department of Pediatrics and Associate Director of the Treuman Katz Center for Pediatric Bioethics. Before introducing our speaker, I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about Treuman Katz, for whom this lecture is named. Treuman was president and CEO here at Children's for 26 years and was recognized really for his visionary leadership, his strong financial management, developing broad-based community support for the hospital and its mission, and expanding pediatric subspecialty services here at Children's and through regional clinics to patients, so patients and families could be seen close to home. During his tenure at Children's, some of Treuman's many accomplishments included developing a model medical school affiliation with the University of Washington and working diligently with the University of Washington and Fred Hutch to develop the SCCA to speed the delivery of new treatments for cancer. And he initiated the strengthening of the research program we have now and prompted a strategic plan to grow research. He did all of this while working with federal and state legislatures, the governor, and physician leaders to advocate for child health, injury prevention, and early learning. In honor of, another accomplishment of Treuman's was his commitment to really developing the first Center for Pediatric Bioethics, which emerged out of his longstanding interest in quality of care and respecting the role of families in decision-making, as well as an emerging appreciation of the role of clinical research in advancing pediatric healthcare. So in honor of Treuman and his incredible achievements, the Seattle Children's Board of Trustees established the Treuman Katz Center for Pediatric Bioethics now over a decade ago, as well as this Treuman Katz Lectureship in Pediatric Bioethics, which occurs annually. So thank you, Treuman. Let me now introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Jecker is a colleague and a professor of bioethics and humanities here at University of Washington with adjunct appointments in the Department of Philosophy and School of Law. She received her PhD in philosophy from the University of Washington. She's published 2 books and numerous publications on ethical issues in healthcare, including justice in healthcare, resource allocation, and medical futility. I'd add that many of us at the Treuman Katz Center have benefited from her mentorship and tutelage over the years, including myself. She currently serves on the board of the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities. And relevant to her talk today, she joined the World Health Organization's Division on Ethics and Population Health project in 2017 to develop an ethics framework for aging and health. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jecker.
Thank you very much, Dr. Opel. Good morning. It's really a privilege to be here, and I want to thank my colleagues at Treuman Katz Center for Pediatric Bioethics for making this possible. And I also want to thank each of you for attending. The title of my talk is Ending Midlife Bias, Ethics for Pediatrics and the Rest of Life. And what I will be presenting today is part of a much larger work. It's a book entitled Ending Midlife Bias, New Values for Old Age, which is forthcoming with Oxford, I think, in early 2020. I want to acknowledge also generous support from the Japanese government, the Brochet Foundation, and each of the universities listed here. Their support made it possible for me to do the work that I am sharing with you today. I'm going to start with a series of questions. And these are the questions that sort of got me thinking about these issues. And I'm still in the process of trying to work through them. The first question is, what is midlife bias? That's in my title, so I better explain it. Second, what's wrong with it? Why should we worry about it? How does it negatively impact philosophy, bioethics, and most importantly, pediatric bioethics? And finally, how could we make it better? What would a more balanced view look like? What should an ethics for pediatric bioethics reflect? So I'll start with midlife bias, as I said. And this is an idea that I'm going to circle back to again and again over the course of my presentation. And right now, I just want to plant a seed, and I'll try to get it to germinate and grow for us. Midlife bias is the claim that we often take for granted the perspective of someone in early or mid-adulthood, someone who is in the midst of planning for a future adulthood that sort of stretches out in front of them. This can lead to a focus on certain values, such as respect for autonomy, often to the exclusion of other values, which I'll say a little bit more about later. As you know, autonomy occupies quite a privileged place in the US and many Western nations. It refers literally to the ability to be self-governing. Originally, the term autonomy was applied to states, not to people. It was applied to a polis, not individuals, and it referred to those states that democratically chose their own laws, in contrast with colonies that accepted laws imposed by a mother country. Later, autonomy was applied to individuals. So you have Kant in the 18th century arguing that our moral standing as individuals, and even our moral worth as individuals, is based on our capability for autonomy and rational agency. Since Kant, and since the Enlightenment era more broadly, much of the history of moral philosophy in the West proceeds without direct consideration of the interests of those who are not autonomous, such as children. And I've often wondered about this, both as a philosopher and as a parent. This is a picture of my kids in the 1990s. Why are children missing? Why have they gone missing from so many accounts of the moral life? And I've come to believe that a central reason is midlife bias. From the perspective of an adult, children are more readily seen as the property of adults. They're more readily seen as the extension of their parents or maybe a parent's project. Using the yardstick of midlife to measure kids, they look like little us, little adults, or future adults. They look incomplete or even defective and inferior. They lack something that mature adults have. To illustrate this idea of midlife bias, I'm going to give you a tour. And the first stop on our tour is going to be ancient Greece. This is Aristotle, who famously said, "No child is happy." Why? Well, children just aren't capable of complex moral and intellectual activities that he thought constituted a flourishing life. For example, children do not yet possess capacities that allow them to choose for themselves or to perform excellent acts of courage and contemplation. According to Aristotle, when we call a child happy, what we mean is that the child is anticipating these higher achievements of adulthood. Kant, as I've mentioned, identifies the dignity of individual human beings with rational agency and capacity for autonomous choice. It follows that children have value at best derivatively by virtue of the future adults that they will become. In the 20th century, Feinberg argued that children have a right to have their future left open as fodder for future choice. Those who stand in a fiduciary role should act in ways that respect a child's future autonomy so that children enter adulthood with robust choices. If we fast forward to the 21st century and to my own discipline, philosophy, contemporary philosophy, you have folks like Tamar Shapiro, a philosopher at MIT, who argues that to be a child is to find oneself at a lower stage of development. Children, she says, find themselves in a predicament. And our job as adults is to help them get out of it. Michael Sloat, a philosopher at the University of Miami, claims that the good for human beings is the exercise of virtue, very Aristotelian. Yet only adults can aspire to moral goodness, since they have the time and experience to acquire, to cultivate and perfect the habits constitutive of virtues. Sarah Hannon, a Canadian philosopher, regards childhood as regrettable due to the impaired capacity for practical reasoning, the lack of an established identity, and profound and asymmetric vulnerability. The final stop on our tour is pop philosophy. This is the New York Times bestselling author Amy Chow, who writes a lot about how to be a good parent. And what she says, she instructs parents that their job is producing ambitious, successful, and happy adults. If we switch from philosophy to bioethics, and the connection here I hope is clear, philosophy has been extremely influential in bioethics. So take this as backdrop, let's switch to bioethics, and we'll find that just as autonomy occupies a privileged place in moral philosophy, autonomy is held in high regard in bioethics, where it is standard to stress human capacities for agency and to emphasize the special moral status accorded on this basis. In the words of Bruce Jennings, who is a political scientist and longtime contributor to the field, no single concept has been more important in the contemporary development of bioethics than the concept of autonomy. And none better reflects both the philosophical and the political currents shaping the field. Applied to children, a principle of autonomy generates what I call a prep school model of childhood. The prep school model pictures children as future adults, sees our job as delivering them safe, and basically turning them into good adults. Drawing on the prep school model, pediatric decision-making often focuses on respecting a child's future autonomy. Let me give you some more concrete examples. Discussing the care of critically ill infants in neonatal intensive care units, Seigel et al., and that should be a G, not a T, recommended respecting infant autonomy. So this is neonatal ICU. You respect infant autonomy. Well, how do you go about that? You assign preferences to the infant based on the preferences of adults who were previously low birth weight infants. Creative. Neonatal circumcision is also marked by an autonomy-based approach put forth by opponents of neonatal circumcision who argue that the child has a right to decide for himself, and circumcision fails to respect the autonomy of the child, thereby violating this right. And this issue remains very controversial, as many of you know. In 2012, a Cologne district court in Germany ruled that non-therapeutic circumcision was illegal on the ground that it violates a child's right to self-determination. This caused quite a stir at the time among Jewish and Muslim communities. It was actually subsequently overturned by the German legislature, which ironically appealed to autonomy again, but this time to parents' autonomy. And if you're interested, in 2013, there was an entire issue, a thematic issue of the Journal of Medical Ethics devoted to this topic, and there's lots of discussion about autonomy and what respect for autonomy looks like in this context. Dina Davis argues that respecting the child's right to an open future demands not testing minors for adult onset conditions such as Huntington's disease, so that they can choose as future adults whether or not they'd like to have this information. She also argues that parents who refuse a cochlear implant for a deaf child act wrongly because they preclude the child from having the tools to leave deaf culture, thereby confining the future adult to a narrow group of people and a limited choice of careers. Lastly, autonomy is again invoked in pediatric bioethics when it is argued that religious instruction violates autonomy if the aim is having one's child belong to a certain faith. So I've laid out a number of examples. We may or may not agree with the bioethics positions that I've just described, but what I'd like to call your attention to, however, is not the positions themselves, but rather their underlying rationale, that is, the reasoning used in their defense. In each case, justification for the position appeals to autonomy and respect for autonomy as a basis for making decisions on behalf of children. So that's a certain picture of how we ought to go about making decisions on behalf of children. What's wrong with that picture? What's wrong with all of these pictures? See anything that looks a little off? These are pictures from the 16th and 17th century. They're mostly European. There is one American artist, the mother-daughter picture, is a painting by an American artist, Thomas Smith. Little adults, okay. So what's wrong with all of these pictures is that they're really not pictures of children. This little boy in a dress is a toddler, but he's really not dressed like a toddler. If you see the mother-daughter painting, they are wearing the exact same clothes. And this small boy is wearing a top hat. So they're dressed like adults. They're not pictures of children. They're pictures of children, as someone said, as little adults. So interestingly, just like philosophers, artists, especially prior to the 18th century, rarely depicted children. When they did, they showed them this way, as miniature adults. They wore the same clothing and they engaged in the same activities. Again, this is what I'm calling midlife bias, a tendency to apply midlife values and standards to all life stages, to see the world through the lens of midlife. So why should we worry about that? Well, what's wrong with midlife bias is that values change and should change as we move through the stages of our lives. The values that matter most to us as infants and small children differ from those we hold most dear in our teen years, or in early adulthood, or in later life. It might be tempting to think that midlife really is the gold standard, the pinnacle, and other values are second best. Children, in other words, can't have what adults do, so they have to sort of settle. They can't be autonomous. I think that idea is reflected, for example, in what I called the prep school model, where childhood's value is instrumental. It's preparation for something that really counts. Yet to see things this way is already to assume a midlife stance. If we imagine ourselves instead as small children, utterly dependent on others, the values that would matter most would be being cared for and nurtured by someone we trusted. Our condition of vulnerability and dependency would make those values the right ones for us. More broadly speaking, the highest value for a person relates to their life stage circumstances. Of course, it relates to many other things as well, but I think there is a life stage pattern to values, and that we can understand what's going on better if we have an awareness of that and sensitivity to it. So the idea of the life stage relativity of values expresses the claim that at different stages along the trajectory of our lives, different values generally do and generally should become central. So allow me to lay out more clearly what I think is wrong with midlife bias, and I'm going to introduce 3 specific objections. The first objection asks you to go with me on a thought experiment. Try to imagine a world without any children in it. Most of you would be out of jobs. But the way we'd arrive at this world without children is, of course, by a pill. So imagine that there were a pill that you could take as a child that would instantly turn you into an adult. The same adult you would have been if you had grown up in the usual way. You could skip childhood and be able to spend a lot more time doing the things that adults do, that you do now. And you'd have all the capacities that adults have. Let me just see a show of hands. How many of you wish you had taken that pill as a child yourself? Just see a show of hands. Nobody, okay. How many would recommend it to their patients? How many would give a prescription for a pill like that? Anyone? or for your own kids. That's a little tougher. So I believe the reason we wouldn't use the pill is that we cherish childhood. So we value it for its own sake. It's not just preparation for something else. We value not only parenting children, teaching them, doctoring and nursing them, but also just being around them. There is some intrinsic value to childhood, not contingent on the future adults that they become. Here's a second objection. I call it the Tom Sawyer objection. In Mark Twain's 1876 novel, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, we read these wonderful stories about how much fun Tom has as a kid with his friend Huck. They travel along the Mississippi River in a raft. Tom skips school. He falls in love with Becky Thatcher, and they get engaged by kissing. Remember that book? Around the same time that Twain published this book, John Stuart Mill's autobiography was also published, a nonfiction work published posthumously in 1873. Now, in stark contrast to Tom, John Stuart's childhood was a lot of hard work to prepare him for British social life. He was taught entirely at home by his father. At age 3, he was fluent in Greek. At 8, he was well-versed in classical and historical literature. And by his teens, he was a serious scholar of math, political economy, and philosophy. Sadly, whatever John Stuart's accomplishments, he felt he fell short in his father's eyes. Quoting, "If I thought anything about myself, it was that I was rather backward in my studies, since I always found myself to be so in comparison with what my father expected from me." So here's the question: would you rather have Tom's childhood or John Stuart's? How many would rather have Tom's? Yeah, okay. So most of us would prefer Tom's, and this is because Tom had a chance to be a kid. And we value that. We value having a chance to live childhood as children. Last objection I call the empty life objection. And this objection holds that, on reflection, we don't really want what Feinberg says we do. We don't really want all of our options open. The closing of options, if we think about it, is inevitable and not necessarily a matter for regret. A life lived with maximal options open until, say, 21 would be unfocused and glib, whereas a life led by passion, channeled to and directed to fewer options, can be flourishing and rich. Another way to think about this is that the prep school model assumes that children are like saplings. Saplings are sort of small, weedy versions of trees, but one day, under the right conditions, they'll become trees. A better way, I think, to see children is as their own kind of thing. We might view children as being like caterpillars, which aren't immature butterflies. They're just a different kind of thing. A caterpillar doesn't look anything like a butterfly. If children are to adults as caterpillars are to butterflies, they are not an inferior version of an adult. They are just a different kind of thing. The caterpillar view opens the door to exploring a positive view of childhood. And that's the path that I want to take us down. And I want to turn to this task briefly, asking what might a more balanced view look like? What might an ethics for pediatric look like if it was not dominated so much by this idea of future adulthood? This is an 18th century painting by the French artist Chardin. And do you notice anything about this painting? Different from the ones I had up a moment ago. This shout out, anything? He's playing with the top. Does everyone see the top right there? This is reportedly the first painting in the West to show a child as a child. This kid is playing. He's having fun. So I think that an ethics for pediatric can learn something from this painting by Chardin. I think it suggests that we should safeguard the goods of childhood, like playing with a top, because these are valuable in themselves. What exactly do I mean by the goods of childhood? They consist of the central things that children are able to do and be. These goods might be unique to childhood due to children's unique features of childhood, children's lack of experience, their neuroplasticity, their physical agility, the way we organize our society. There's some unique features about society that might make these goods possible. And they also might be childhood specific, meaning that they might be goods only when we are children. Being innocent and carefree is a great quality for a small child, may not be such a great quality in later life. Before I say more about the goods of childhood, I want to touch briefly on the broader idea of human capabilities, and then I'll focus in on childhood versions of these. So I'm asking here, what are the types of things that we can do and be as human beings more broadly? And they might include a list such as the following. First, life. And I understand life not in the purely biological sense, a heart beating or brain activity. Instead, the way I'll be using the term, to be alive in the way that matters is to have a narrative. That is, a story of one's life that is not yet over. Health. Being able to have good health, being adequately nourished, being able to have adequate shelter. Bodily integrity is another human capability. Being able to use one's body to realize one's desires and goals. So for example, being able to move freely from place to place, which looks different at different stages of our lives. Senses, imagination, and thought. Being able to imagine, think, reason, and use the senses in a human way. Emotions. By that I mean being able to feel and express a range of human emotions. That's one of the central things we can do and be. Practical reason, being able to form a conception of the good and to engage in critical reflection about the planning of one's life. So that should sound a little bit familiar. Autonomy is a central human capability, although it does not define us as human beings. It's part of who we are. Affiliation is too, being able to live for and in relation to others. So this would include, family relationships, community, ties with past and present humanity, perhaps. Nature, being able to live with concern for and in relation to animals and the world of nature. Play, being able to laugh, to play, to enjoy recreational activities. And I think this is important across the lifespan. When I started thinking about this, I used to think, well, play is just something that kids do. But actually, it's something that's like a social glue is the term I've used to refer to it. A good game of cards is something that we enjoy in later life that's a form of play that connects us to others. Environment, being able to participate in social and political life and to exercise some measure of control over our immediate physical environment. So an ethics for pediatrics will make, I think, a reasonable effort to ensure that children have a threshold level of each of these central capabilities and have the chance to exercise them in life stage appropriate ways. Capabilities, as I understand them, are not binary, they're scalar, so they fall along a continuum, and our duty, as I'm proposing, is to bring children to a floor level, to make a reasonable effort to bring children to a floor level. What might that look like? Well, let me go through some of these briefly. For example, in childhood, a life narrative might include having free time, a carefree approach, aimlessness, and openness to future possibilities. As adults, as we all know, we're more hamstrung by plans and expectations. Children are freer to welcome kind of improbable adventures. Health, being able to have adequate health, nourishment, and shelter based on the specific health needs kids have. And we probably wouldn't be a lunch like that. Bodily integrity, being able to use one's body to realize one's goals and desires. Senses, imagination, and thought, being read to, being spoken to, early education and enrichment. Emotions, being able to bond, that is to love and trust without reservation, to have a kind of moral innocence and confidence in human goodness, certainly not possible for every child, but often more possible for children than adults. Practical reason, having life stage related abilities to form and reflect about a plan of life. Affiliation, childhood friendships, I think, often differ in important respects from adult ones. People report feeling an attachment to childhood friends out of all proportion to the sorts of shared interests and beliefs that make up these friendships. It may have to do with the absolute trust that is possible in childhood, or perhaps with something like a child's perception of time as endless, which can lend a sense of permanency or foreverness to childhood friendships. Nature, being able to live in relation to animals. Isn't she cute in that dog? Being able to live in relation to animals and nature, being able to spend time outdoors. Play. This was my kid's favorite toy. There's a kind of play we do as children that differs from the kind of play we do as adults. Children can become, as you know, absorbed in fantasy and make-believe worlds. Sometimes the unique play of childhood relates to physical skills like flexibility and agility, sometimes to mental plasticity, curiosity, just the ability to imagine radically different worlds. Finally, having opportunities to meaningfully contribute to a school or a team or a troop or other childhood groups and environments. These goods contribute to a good childhood, and for this reason have value over and above whether they prepare children for adulthood. Notice that if someone misses these childhood goods, they cannot readily be made up. We cannot regain innocence, have more adult friends to compensate for not having childhood ones, or play more as adults to compensate for not playing during childhood. As the expression goes, the window closes. Where does this leave autonomy? Well, I think, as I hinted at, any conception of the intrinsic goods of childhood should include autonomy, but it should include children's autonomy as children. Even fairly young children possess some degree of autonomy, and that fact has significance for how we ought to treat them. So I'm going to leave you with a final thought experiment. This is Felix. Imagine that Felix is sort of standing outside his life. He's under what philosophers call a veil of ignorance. That means he doesn't know a lot of important stuff. He does not know what kind of society he will live in, nor does he know what kind of childhood or adulthood he will have. He must choose how much, if any, of his life to spend as a child, and how much, if any, as an adult. Based on what I've suggested, the right thing for Felix to do is to choose human life in all its fullness. As an infant, Felix will not have the autonomy of an adult. As a middle-ager, he will miss the free time of childhood. As an old man, he will not be innocent. Yet, over the course of his whole life, he will have it all. I want to thank you very much for your attention.
Talk. Thank you so much. Coming to Ethics Ground Rounds is always intriguing and exciting and tear-bringing sometimes. I have a couple of just thoughts, not really questions so much, but I wonder if you had turned that question around and asked the audience how many of you would take a pill as an adult to turn you back into a child. I'd like to see a show of hands on that one. All right. The other thought I have is what is wrong with some of these adults that think about kids the way they do? And a quote I think I heard at maybe a Pediatrics bioethics conference was by Dr. Seuss: "Adults are just obsolete children, and to hell with them."
That's great. I love that. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Nancy. That was really thought-provoking. I have some more specific questions now that you've sort of laid out sort of your sort of thesis about how we should be thinking about ethics in pediatrics and engaging children and families in decision makings, particularly in healthcare. Help me think through how we should do things differently, more specifically in some of the examples you gave, for instance, cochlear implants or testing for adult onset diseases. Should we be changing those in the way we're doing them now? How do we think about this new ethics you're proposing with respect to reserving the right to an open future, or sort of preserving or respecting the child's developing autonomy?
That's an excellent question. Thanks very much, Dr. Opel. So I think in a particular case, how we balance these values out is going to turn a lot on the particular features of the case. I think it's difficult in a general way to say this is the most important value or to rank order them. What I would urge instead is that we consider, for example, risk-taking of certain types, because these risk-taking allows children to experience childhood, to go out on a playground, to walk on the beach, even though there are risks associated with that, perhaps life-threatening risks for someone who this might be the only opportunity afforded them. So it's going to depend upon the specific details of the situation, but what I would want to loosen up is the grip of autonomy as sort of the absolute deciding value, especially when we're making decisions for children who are at the end of their lives, who don't have a future adulthood. There I think it's most clear that we need to focus on how to optimize now. But I would argue that that kind of decision making, that kind of broader focus on childhood now is something that is appropriate across the board in pediatric decision making, not only when making decisions for children whose prognosis indicates that they're not going to live to adulthood. So for children that are going to live a normal lifespan, we should also think about childhood values, teen values, as well as adult values. I think ultimately we need to think about the whole course of a life, not just about childhood, not just about midlife, but about the whole story, the whole, as I say, in the first human capability, the whole narrative of a life is who that individual is. I don't think that answers your particular question, but I hope it paints in a broad brush kind of way the perspective that I would encourage to bring to those sorts of decisions. Whether we're talking about lots of different situations, but the way we think about best interest standard, for example, should incorporate more than just best interest as a future adult, but should also incorporate the best interest and the intrinsic goods of the child now as a child, and the opportunities we want to preserve for the child as such. Does that help? Thank you for your question. Yeah.
Very thought-provoking, and I want to take Doug's question one step further and look at the issue of assent. So in research, we theoretically ask children for their assent, and a lot of times don't take their withdrawal of assent very seriously. Or even in a clinical situation, if you have a child who says, no, 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 I don't want that shot, I don't want you to put that needle in me, how does your perspective impact those very pragmatic, immediate situations where we would love to have children's assent but don't necessarily get it?
That's a tough one. So if we ask for kids to volunteer for vaccinations or shots or to have a catheter, they would say no, and we wouldn't get their consent. It's going to vary depending on their age and their ability to understand the long-term benefits and weigh those. But certainly with small kids, it's going to require physical restraint or sedation or some other coercive means. And I think, of course, we should do our best in an age-appropriate way and really an individual-appropriate way, because not all kids are the same, even at the same age. to show respect for the child's autonomy as a child. And the autonomy of a 2 or 3-year-old is going to look different, as we know, from that of a later child or a teen. So I think it's a scalar concept, and it changes over time. It's a moving target. So it's hard to lump kids and to say, how should we do this for children? I think how we do this for children depends upon the stage of life the child's at, their level of maturity and understanding, their age. And how we do this depends upon the stakes. It depends upon the seriousness of the choice. Can it be delayed? Can we try to engage and persuade? There are different, what are the risks of delaying? So there are all kinds of factors that go into these complex decisions. And one of them, I want to argue, one of them that we should keep in mind is that there's some values and intrinsic values of childhood that we should try to honor and recognize and be aware of, and that really should be in the forefront of our mind when we're making decisions on behalf of kids. So if we're just thinking about the future adult, it's easier to engage in a coercive means to achieve our ends. But if we see the child in front of us as having these intrinsic goods, if there being some value in respecting their autonomy wherever it's at this point, then we would engage the child in a different way. And I would argue a better way. Does that help to address your question? It's difficult without a particular case in front of me because I think the decision is going to hang on all these particular features of the case that I mentioned. Yeah.
Thank you. That was a wonderful talk. In your introduction, you mentioned that a lot of your collaborators were from the Far East. And I'm wondering whether in those collaborations, whether there was a different perspective that you learned on these questions from being with people from Japan or China or other places in the world, or whether this is a perspective that mostly applies to the West, whether there are different cultural and value issues that are part of other places in the world.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, I think one of the reasons I started traveling when I started working on this book is I couldn't find the values that I was looking for. I understood, I thought the conversations here and the debates here and the way the problems were framed and laid out in the US and in Western philosophy and bioethics, but I didn't find articulated the concepts and ideas that I was looking for. So I started traveling to non-Western countries, primarily East Asia, some Southeast Asia, and some Africa. And I found that as soon as I got out of the US almost, the emphasis of values was quite different. So it was much more collectivist. I lived in Japan this summer. It's much more family-oriented. And the idea of sort of striking out on one's own as an individual and being unfettered is really a foreign idea. And the notion of solidarity in European society, the notions of what's called Ubuntu collectivism in South Africa and sub-Saharan societies is really very rich in a completely different orientation than the individualism and autonomy that we find here in the West. So I think there are richer notions, and I do think that notions other than autonomy that are worth exploring and introducing here. I think we have a lot to learn, not just to share our ideas, but to learn from those and try to incorporate them. One of the things that struck me is that midlife bias looks different in different parts of the world. I think if I focus on autonomy, it's really a bias, an implicit bias, that a perspective that we assume without even thinking about it when we are coming from a society where autonomy is highly prized. In other parts of the world, other values are held dear and put up as central. And I think the kinds of biases that come with a midlife perspective look different in different societies and different cultures. So I've learned a lot from my colleagues in East Asia in particular, and the perspectives there that focus more on family. One of the ways this played out, and I was looking primarily at decision-making at the end of life and advanced care planning, which wouldn't apply as much to pediatric decision-making. But the concern there was that the individual couldn't make an advanced care directive because it might impact the family negatively, and these decisions couldn't be made in isolation. They had to be made together with the family. So we shifted the notion in this pilot study we were doing with different kinds of advanced care tools to empowerment. And who was empowered was not just the individual, it was the whole family group to make decisions on behalf of a family member. So there are different ways of shifting and molding these values and shaping them to fit beyond the individual with whatever that collective looks like. I think there are also critiques of that and worries about that that I've thought about as well, but I do think it's a path worth walking down. So thank you for that question. There's some others. I'm not sure who is next. Yeah.
I want to thank you so much for this presentation. It's very inspiring. I come to these grand rounds as a clinical social worker doing psychotherapy with children. And very often I'm caught in a place with parents in a tension between they're wanting to have this, I like the term you use, this prep school model for childhood versus allowing children to be children and trusting in their unfoldment. And I find your presentation so in line with Magda Gerber's resources for infant educators, infant educaring approach, which really advocates for allowing children to have uninterrupted play, even infants, and valuing what they're doing moment to moment, and providing most interactions during caregiving activities. You know, I want to respond a little bit to the question earlier about assent, because certainly one of the things that I see so much is parents going either into a very authoritarian method of parenting or a very laissez-faire method. Mm-hmm. And certainly, you know, when a child needs to have some kind of medication or injection, the child may not be able to be given a choice about whether or not that's administered, but can be given the choice of whose lap would you like to sit on, what would you like to have happen after this is administered. So in that way, we have other options that help inspire mastery, and that mastery is something that a child takes throughout the lifetime. So I feel like your presentation has really provided me with an excellent foundation and grounding for these things that I believe in my work. So thank you very much.
Thank you for your comment.
Hi, thank you for that very nice talk. Your talk, the philosophers that you cited are a bunch of boneheads, if you ask me. And you were able to actually crystallize why I never liked Aristotle all those years ago in college. Thank you. For that alone, I thank you. But this concept of autonomy, I agree with you. I think it's a really American thing, and I think it's incredibly, I think it has a lot of value and is also incredibly unhealthy in many ways. And I think our politics actually reflect that. And you don't have to go to Japan to see, I mean, Western Europe is a lot like you described the Far East. You know, when I lived in France, if there was a party, there were babies and 10-year-olds and 20-year-olds and 50-year-olds and 80-year-olds. Nobody would think to have a party without everyone. That was just inconceivable. So my question to you is there a way that we can push the other interests? Like, because if you think about a child, for instance, to your point, for those of us who take care of children who die, once they die, you see the hole that they have created by disappearing, and also the profound influence they had on the world that you don't think about when a child goes from 10 to 15 to 20 and lives it has the fortune to live a long life. So is there a way to do that? Is there a way we can push that a little bit? Because I think it would be healthy for this society. The other thing I would add was actually Stephen Dubner had a little thing on Freakonomics Radio about tiger moms. And an economist actually looked at it and found that it doesn't do any good. But he also said that the thing that children remember is their parents' kindness to them. Anyway, so I just wonder what you think about that, and thank you again.
Thank you very much for your comments. So how to get from where we are to where we'd like to go, that's a tough question. I think one way to get there are many paths that I would encourage. One way to get there is to introduce more cross-cultural perspectives in the university and our conversations, to be more open to that and to integrate it more. We have a very diverse society, a very diverse population, so in many ways it's easier to do that here in the United States than it is in many other parts of the world that are more, where societies are more homogeneous. I think we can play off of that diversity to enrich our conversation and enrich our perspectives, because a lot of these values, you don't have to travel very far to find them. They're in our communities, they're in our neighborhoods, so I would draw on that richness. The other thing I think that will help move us in that direction is the graying of societies all over the globe. The populations are aging, and the values that loom large for people in later life when we have increased risk of cognitive and physical disabilities and impairments are going to look quite different. And I think that will also help to get us thinking, kickstart sort of the conversations about a wider conception of human capabilities and values that would include not only autonomy, I don't want to throw that out the window, but also affiliation, play, senses, imagination and thought, environment, nature, all these broader, richer ways that are central to who we are as human beings. And someone mentioned not thinking about it in a binary way, not going to very permissive or very autocratic. I think we do need to think of these as, I had the picture of the ladder up on one of my slides, as a matter of degrees and moving closer to where we want to be, which is this threshold level of all of these central capabilities. If we just think and get fixated on one capability, like practical reason or thought, we lose the bigger picture of who we are as human beings and what makes us human, and our shared, not just capabilities, but vulnerabilities. So thank you very much for that question. That's an excellent question. How do we get there? Yes?
Thank you very much, and I look forward to reading your book. I'm hoping for a Kindle version.
It's coming in Amazon Kindle, yeah.
I think you'd find an ally for your final closing point in Aristotle, who said in the Nicomachean Ethics that you really can't judge a life until you've seen it in its fullness, right? You can't even say someone was happy until after they're dead, right? You have to see their life in its entirety. And I would just like to point that out to my colleague, that Aristotle, though being a bonehead in many things, did have a few things that might agree with you.
Thank you. Thank you.